Let me ask you to go ahead and turn your Bible, if you would, to Matthew 14, Matthew chapter 14. I want to welcome everybody and welcome to all of you who are guests. We're so glad to have our children and their spouses, or maybe we should claim the spouses and then our children, anyway, all of them with us this morning, and for the rest of you, welcome as well. Thanks so much to Jack for preaching. Last week, I was in Memphis and co-taught a one-week class at Harding School of Theology, which is a school connected to Harding University, or actually a part of Harding University, where men and women come literally from all over the world to prepare themselves for some kind of ministry. Last Tuesday evening, I was with a group of 40 people in the dean's living room as they shared, these 40 people shared either where they had just been in the world or where they were going and what God is doing. A couple just got back from Zambia who live there and have worked there for many years and told amazing stories of God's work. There was a couple back from Italy who told amazing stories of God's work. There was one young woman who's preparing to go to Providence, Rhode Island, with a church planning team connected to Kairos and Stan Granberg, who was here a number of weeks ago. And I'm just telling you, it is so good to hear about the good things God is doing everywhere. He is this God whose work is not limited at all. Appreciate a while ago, Forrest and Bo just welcoming us and calling us into worship. By the way, if this message gets a little lame in a minute, if one of you will get on one side and one on the other, and we'll do something. But I'm just so appreciative of guys like them and all the women and men of this church. Thank you to Michael for his prayer a moment ago. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There are three companions that we know pretty well. We know fear, we know anxiety, and we know worry. And any one of them are liable to creep up at any moment. We know them well. They're familiar to us. Sometimes you might experience waking up in the middle of the night and just feeling this cloud of anxiety and even fear. as you lie there and just think about what could happen. And what if? And then sometimes fear has kind of a jagged edge to it, where you realize you are scared to death. Sometimes you find yourself being pretty anxious and being nervous and afraid, and then somehow things work out, and then you try to figure out how in the world did they work out. You may have seen this a few years ago, this little commercial by Holiday Inn Express, where they apparently think that there's the possibility of a nuclear meltdown, and then some things begin to unfold that are interesting. Let's watch that for a moment. Or we could see that later. Let's move on. Some of the what-if questions.
Reactor 3's at critical mass.
Core temperature still rising.
You're gonna have to provide more cooling in the containment chamber.
God, it started that way.
Okay. Close the flow channels, activate the hydrogen recombiners.
Do it.
Are you new to the team?
Well, actually, I'm with the tour group. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Stay smart. Stay at a Holiday Inn Express.
You know, sometimes you find yourself all worked up and anxious, and it kind of works out, and then you say something like, well, isn't that something? It was going to work out anyway. Here I was all worried about that. There are some things that happen and some solutions I don't know how to explain, except to just say that somehow God is in the middle of it. Think of all the what-if questions you've asked in your life. What if? Some of them are pretty serious. What if the test results come back positive? What if my child has to go back and take the same grade again? What if my company finds out that I don't know as much as they think I know? What if we can't afford it? What if the economy completely collapses? What if I lose my job? What if we have to move? And on and on and on. Have you asked those questions before? I'd like for us, for a moment, to look at this story in Matthew chapter 14. It's a wonderful story, and it's an encouraging story in a lot of ways. I like the way this begins in chapter 14, verse 22, where Jesus sends his disciples, or makes his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. He dismisses them, and then he goes up to a mountainside by himself to pray. And I don't think that's an accident that Matthew includes that in this text. That here is this story where Jesus has the disciples going ahead of him while he prays. And he prays on this mountainside, and apparently he's praying for quite a while. They go on ahead. They're in a boat. They're apparently on the Sea of Galilee, and it's rough. And the wind and the waves are just beating against this boat. And these guys are scared. That particular lake is many feet. I think it's about 600 feet actually below sea level. And then there are these high mountains that surround the Sea of Galilee and these deep ravines, and I'm told that the wind would come whipping through those ravines, sort of like wind in a tunnel, and just tear up that sea, the lake, Sea of Galilee. Well, they're on the lake, and it's kind of wild. And they look and they see the unbelievable. And I don't know how to explain this. If you want to say, well, how did Jesus do this? I don't have a clue. I just believe he did. He is literally walking on water. Now, you can try this in your pool. You can try this in your bathtub. You can try this in the ocean. I've never, ever done this. But he literally did walk on water. And these guys are terrified when they see him. And listen to his words. Take courage. It is I. It is I. Don't be afraid. And they cry out, it's a ghost. It's the unexplainable. And Peter looks at him and says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. And Jesus said one of the most powerful words in this story. He said, come. Our little series here is entitled Jesus Calling, because I believe Jesus really is calling for us to respond to him. Jesus says, come. And Peter steps out of the boat, and he literally starts walking on water. Now, we can get all over Peter, for what he's going to do in a minute. That's okay. The rest of them sat there and watched. And Peter steps out and he starts walking toward the Lord. And he started looking around at what was going on, the water and the wind. And he got scared. And he began to sink. And I think Jesus gently went over to him and said, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? In other words, you were doing so well. And then, of course, mind you, everybody else is just watching this. And we'll talk about this in a moment. But when you exercise faith in your life, most people around you are going to be in the position of these guys in the boat. They'll just be watching. Don't be surprised when you feel alone. Jesus and Peter come back toward the boat. And they're just they cannot believe this. And they worship the Lord. Now, I've never walked on water. I've never even had a serious thought about walking on water. But I sure know fear, don't you? And I know worry. And I know anxiety. And unfortunately, the three of them and myself are on a first name basis. We are real acquainted. If you look at the back of your order of worship, it might be helpful to you at this point. Let's talk for a moment about what happens when fear shows up. There's a wonderful book by Ronald Rolheiser. The book is entitled The Restless Heart. And Rolheiser talks about the fear that so many of us feel. He says one of the greatest forces that serves to keep us in isolation from each other is fear. All of us are imprisoned to a greater or lesser extent by a bad self-image and a sense of shame that keeps us living in fear of many things. Mainly, we fear that we are unlovable, that others will reject us, and that we're not good enough. Also, we are ashamed of our own bodies, ashamed of the dark corners of our minds, and ashamed at some level of our very persons. Think for a moment about some things that you fear. Some of us, for instance, fear the loss of control. If you've ever been referred to as a control freak, which probably you quickly denied, or I don't know, maybe you accepted it. But some of us who we just want to dominate all of the details. We fear losing control. Some of us are afraid that maybe we will one day appear incompetent. People will see that we don't have what it takes for whatever particular task is at hand. Some of us, depends on your age, but some of us are afraid that as I get out of my college years, that eventually I'll just stop appearing cool. That people who are younger will look at me and they won't think I'm cool. They won't, and then later on the language changes a bit and we begin to think, maybe people won't value me anymore. They valued me for a while at a certain age or a certain level in my career, and then now they're looking at other people and valuing them. And it's a real fear. Some of us fear that one day our children will grow up and they'll no longer need us. If you know what it is, and you probably don't know what it is, you've just seen people like this, I'm sure. But if you've seen people who just hover over their children, well, we don't want him to feel any pain at all in his life, because what would happen? Well, he would feel bad. That'd be terrible if he felt bad. We don't want her to be disappointed, because that would be a setback. We're trying to be encouragers, and so we just hover and hover and hover, and some of that may be rooted in the fear that one day my children are going to grow up and they're not going to need me anymore. Some of us may be afraid that, well, we're going to grow old. And somebody's going to say you can't drive anymore. And somebody's going to want to move me out of my house into assisted living, whatever that is. It sounds like a cleaned up term for things I don't want to do. What do I do with that? All I'm telling you is it doesn't matter how young you are or how old you are. Fear and anxiety and worry are real. And sometimes they dominate. Sometimes fear can just dominate your life. You're afraid to try anything because you may look silly. You talk like a know-it-all about any subject. Oh yeah, I know all about that. Oh yeah, I've got all that. Yeah, I know that. I know what that's about. Oh, I can tell you about, you want to know about hockey, lacrosse? What is it you want to know? Soccer? What is it you want? I can tell you, I got it down. And you see this sad, this sad, insecure man or woman desperately trying to tell people that they're worth something. But fear has a way of paralyzing you. You're afraid to think. You're afraid to try anything. You're afraid to admit that you don't know things. You're afraid to admit you've got a lot to learn. What would that look like? What will people think of me? And I'm telling you, fear can not only paralyze you, it can be the death of you. It can be the death of dreams. You can become just one more mentally and spiritually lazy and slothful human being as you take the safe route and just stay in the boat. Because, why, a fellow could get wet and drown out there. Now, let's think about what happened to Peter for a minute. When Peter, he's in this boat, that either means lunch is ready or time's up or something. But if it keeps ringing, what will we do? Will we ignore it or something? We don't, well, that's what we'll do. Peter, he's in this boat, he sees Jesus, and he steps out. And listen to this. When Peter saw Jesus, he stepped out of the boat, He's filled with courage. He sees Jesus. He steps out of the boat. He's filled with courage. But something else happened. Peter starts looking at his problems. And his biggest problem was that he is standing on water. And it's apparently deep. And the wind and the waves are pretty ferocious. Now Peter is no longer focusing on Jesus. He begins to sink. He's overwhelmed with fear. Isn't that interesting? Peter focuses on his problems, begins to sink, overwhelmed with fear. You say, wasn't he overwhelmed with fear first? Probably. Doesn't really matter. Because when you behave like a fearful person, it exacerbates, the fear just grows. The fear just grows. Fear is not dormant. Fear does not stay in one place. When you feed fear, fear grows. You become more fearful, more frightened, more hesitant. Now, I know we don't want to look that way. Men will strut, and we'll talk about what we've been doing. Yeah, I told that guy I wasn't going to put up with. We say all that mess. And little inadequate men talk like that. Little inadequate women brag and brag and brag. But, the truth is, we're all the same. Peter looks at his problems. Peter looks at his issue. Peter looks at his obstacle. He begins to sink. He's just overwhelmed with fear. Does any of that sound familiar? Let's wrap this up. I stole this title off of the little book, Jesus Calling. And I really think that's what he does to us, maybe for us, through this text this morning. He calls us to no longer live a life of fear, but a life of courage. When you deal with Jesus, and you know that Jesus wants you to take a step, if that step seems to involve risk, if that step seems to be really difficult, you be prepared to be alone. Most people are going to remain in the boat and talk about how dangerous the water is and how dangerous the wind is and how dumb some people are for trying to do the impossible. Most people will stay in the boat. And guys, you guys in high school or college students, it's not weird when you're trying to do the right thing and you just feel very alone. That is the way it's always been. And it's not weird when you're an adult and you feel like that you just feel like that other people are just not trying to live with faith. I mean, it's not unusual. That is not unusual. And so I don't want to just be really hard on Peter here. Because the guy at least took a step toward the Lord. Sometimes, are you like this? I noticed this about myself in the last couple of years. I noticed that sometimes there are some occasions when I don't make a move unless I've got every one of my ducks in a row. I mean, unless I've got every detail worked out, figured out, I don't want to make a move. Anybody like that? Now, obviously, there's great value in preparation, great value and great wisdom in preparation. But sometimes You can become so obsessive about wanting to have every detail worked out that what you're doing is trying to figure out ways to eliminate the need to trust in the Lord because you think you've kind of got it figured out where it's bound to work and the risk just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. I love this story because here's the good news. Jesus is greater than any problem I have right now or I'll ever face. Jesus is greater than any problem I have right now or that I'll ever face. Jesus is greater than whatever I'm worried about right now. Jesus is greater than what they told me at the doctor's office last week. Jesus is greater than whatever it is that I'm fearful about in the future. Jesus is greater than obstacles. Jesus is greater than impossibilities. He's greater than all of this. Now, I want you to look for a moment at the back of your order of worship. Here are the next steps or the take home, and I think these might be helpful. I don't have all this worked out in my own life, but I'm working on it, okay? And here's some things that have been helpful to me. Number one is to pray. This whole thing starts, this story begins with Jesus on a mountainside in prayer. And he's in prayer for a while. I want to begin with prayer. I love this verse. Remember this verse, Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. We're going to witness in just a moment a young man being baptized. Do you know in baptism, Jesus is saying, let me take this so you don't have to bear that. Let me take your sins so you don't have to bear either your past sins, your present sins, or your future sins. Let me take the impossibilities of your life. Let me deal with all this. Because you were never meant to do that. And so we pray, cast all your anxiety on him. Here's a way to do this, just a practical way to do this in prayer. Just begin by, if you want to write it down, but just make a list of, here are the things I'm worried about. Here are the things I'm worried about. Lord, I'm worried about the following things. Don't start with, Lord, you know I shouldn't worry. Just start with, here's what I'm worried about. Here's what I'm fearful about. Here's what I'm anxious about. And just cast those on him. Pray with open hands, releasing everything you're worried about, that you as my mama used to say, that you're fretting about, that you're all worked up about. Release that. Lord, I've been walking around all worked up over this situation. Would you take this? Would you take my worry about my grandchildren? Would you take my worry about my marriage? Would you take my worry about my health? Here's number 2. Stay focused on Jesus instead of your fear. You know what's easy to do? Y'all ever go to the midnight show? I usually go not to the midnight show, but it's about the 2 a.m. show. And generally, there are a number of people involved, but it's all about me and my worry. And on the stage is this situation. I might be lying in bed, or I might get up and worry about it. But at the 2 a.m. show, you're thinking about what could happen. Oh my goodness, if she marries him, oh my goodness, then we're going to be dealing with those people. Oh my goodness, then she's going to be dealing with those people. Oh my goodness, then of course there's that business. Oh my goodness, then of course, and this thing just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Here's somebody that's not even sick, and you're starting to worry about what's going to happen when they die. And then you find yourself all knotted up because we're going to have to sell the house and the way the real estate market is right. And you're worried about things that are just, we don't even have a sick person yet. And I'm not making fun of you, I'm making fun of me. We do that, don't we? And so one of the things I want to do is I want to ask myself, how often am I going to the show? Tonight's episode, fear, and then and spend all this time thinking about it. And guess how much the Lord gets in all that? And you just kind of mumble a prayer after you go to the show at 2 a.m. I love this text because Peter focuses, when he steps out of this boat, not on the fear and what could happen, but he's looking at the Lord. When you look at the Lord and you have this willingness to take a step, you gain some courage you didn't know it was possible for you to have. Has anybody experienced that? Raise your hand if you have. Just think about those times when you just trusted in the Lord and you took a step and you just kind of had this sense of courage and you said, well, I'll be. Oh my goodness. I mean, that's amazing. Second, what I want to learn to do with all my fear and worry is I want to focus on Him. Here's the third one. Take courage. Take courage. This has a lot to do with the way you think. Y'all have any, don't point to anybody please, but does anybody know of any dark, rainy clouds that have legs and arms? I mean, everywhere they go. Well, I have all the bad luck. I knew it was going to be a bad day. Car wouldn't start and tire was low. Blah, blah, blah. And you, boy, by the time they get through with you, and you just feel lousy. And there are people that are always talking about the mess. I don't turn on the radio and just listen to hours and hours of talk radio. It's not because I'm not interested in the conversation. I can't take all of the fearfulness and the worry because I start taking it on. Just, and here's what I'm saying. One of the things you might want to do is think about who are you spending a lot of time with. And if you've got a lot of rainy, dark clouds in your life, you might want to spend less time with them. And if you happen to be married to one, hopefully that person is kind of listening, and you might want to come at this a little differently, because your attitude really does affect your family and your marriage. I love this. Jesus says, take courage, it is I. One of the things you might do when you get up in the morning is just say, Lord, would you make me a courageous person today? Help me not to be so wimpy when I get around my mother-in-law or my grandparents or around my boss or around that supervisor. Help me to fill me with some courage today. Just today. Okay, so those are 3 take-homes. Maybe one of those 3 will be helpful to you. Okay, the first one is pray. The second one, stay focused on Jesus instead of your fear. And the last one is take courage. I want to read one last line from this book, The Restless Heart. Ronald Rolheiser says, we want fidelity, but we want to flirt with every attractive person who comes around. We want fidelity in our marriages, but we also want the freedom to flirt. He says we want to be good persons, but we don't want to make the sacrifice that this demands. He says we want deep roots, but we don't want to forego the intoxication that comes with new stimulus. In short, we want love, but not at the cost of obedience unto death. He's saying what we often want to do is we want it all. And I think sometimes we want it all because we're fearful of letting go. I'm telling you, the life of Jesus is worth releasing the fear. It really is. Jesus is greater than any fear I have had, that I have, or ever will have. Okay, why don't we sing for a moment? And what I'd like to ask you to do is to go home this week and in particular think about these three. Pray, stay focused on Jesus instead of your fear, and then take courage. I'd ask you to think about tomorrow morning just kind of what that means for what's been on your mind lately. Okay? Can we do that? In the meantime, let's sing for a moment. And I want to encourage you, if you need to pray with our elders, some of them will be at the back, and we'll be able to pray with you this morning. If you'd like to be baptized into Christ, this would be a great time to do that. Why don't we stand together and let's sing.
People need the Lord. People need the Lord.